This is the Life at Work Conference podcast, a production of City Bible Forum. Real workers, wrestling with real workplace issues. With your host, Life at Work National Manager, Andrew Laird.
Welcome to episode 1 of the Life at Work Conference podcast. Today, we revisit a highlight from conference favourite Eddie Wu. Plus, I'm joined by a worker from Sydney to discuss being under pressure in the workplace because of her faith. I'm Andrew Laird, and this is the Life at Work Conference podcast. Well, welcome again to this brand new podcast where we'll relive Life at Work Conference highlights, consider timeless issues Christians wrestle with in the workplace, and hear interviews with workers just like you. But before we get to that, for those new to City Bible Forum and the Life at Work Conference, let me tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Now, City Bible Forum is a national organisation, and our aim is to reach the world through workers with the good news of Jesus. And just one of the ways we seek to do that is by equipping people like you, Christians in the workplace, through our annual Life at Work conference, where we aim to bridge that gap between our Christian faith and our daily work. But of course, a conference once a year is not enough to help us do that. So introducing the Life at Work Conference podcast, Real Workers Wrestling with Real Workplace Issues. And to kick off our first episode, we want to revisit a highlight from our conference earlier this year and explore afresh how it applies to our work today. It's from Life at Work Conference 2021, where we looked at the topic under pressure, the blessing of facing the squeeze in the workplace. And to help us consider this topic, we were joined by none other than Eddie Wu, YouTube superstar, former Australian Local Hero of the Year, author, TV presenter, and of course a high school maths teacher. Now, Eddie began his talk by reminding us that all Christians can expect to face pressure, particularly because of their faith. So here's Eddie with a section from his talk titled The Call to Face Pressure.
There was a moment of pressure that many of us faced at some point in 2020 as the coronavirus began to take hold of the world. Perhaps you know the moment I'm talking about. You had deadlines flying at you left, right, and center. There was incredible instability in your work and all kinds of questions over whether the plans you were making would even be relevant in a few days' time when health guidelines changed yet again. What's more, you had to do a lot of this work over email, over phone, over Zoom, as things started to lock down and companies began to require their employees to transition into working from home. And to top it all off, for many of you, you're somehow now also serving double time, experiencing a small taste of what your kids' teachers get all day long. It's 2 p.m. and somehow your kid is still looking for a pencil to write the heading for the schoolwork that got sent home that day. Now, if you remember that feeling, I want to say, I'm here for you. That feeling, I would describe it as the I didn't sign up for this feeling. I didn't sign up for trying to stay sane while self-isolating. I didn't sign up for trying to make life work under these circumstances. I didn't sign up for doing the groceries for my parents who are high risk and shouldn't be going out to the shops. I didn't sign up for this. None of us did. Now, I think we often feel the same way when it comes to facing pressure as Christians in the workplace. It's so tempting to think, I didn't sign up for being that kind of Christian. I've always thought of myself much more as the peaceful and quiet life kind of Christian, you know? I mind my own business, I don't cause a stir. So do I really have to face pressure at work? Now, firstly, I do want to say this is a genuine question for us to wrestle with. In 1 Corinthians 12, we read that God arranges and composes the members of the body, the church, and that they are deliberately diverse. We're not all the same in every way. And part of the point in 1 Corinthians 12 is that there are some within the church who are called to more public, outward-facing roles than others. So is it also true that there are some of us who are called to face pressure as Christians in the workplace and others who are not? The part of us that craves comfort and avoids arguments would love to say yes. But the Bible tells us otherwise. The Bible tells us that all Christians are called to face pressure from the non-Christian world. And we can see this very clearly in the letter of 1 Peter. Read with me in 1 Peter 2, where the apostle writes, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." Just mark this before we go any further. Peter's instructing Christians here, and he's doing it in the context of the workplace. He's talking about those in a working relationship with a master. And he's recognizing that not all earthly masters are worthy of respect in themselves. But we're called to respect our earthly masters nonetheless, not because they're respectable, but because, as we see later on in the verses, this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Mindful of God. Peter's saying that as we look at our earthly masters, our eyes should see past them up to our heavenly master. And it's here where we see why enduring this kind of treatment and facing this kind of pressure is something all of us must be ready for. Right there at the end that you can see on the screen, verse 21, Peter writes, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps." This verse leaves no wiggle room. He says to face this pressure and endure this kind of unfair treatment in the workplace, to this you have been called. Who's been called? Answer: everyone who meets that condition, because Christ suffered for you.
Eddie Wu there at Life at Work Conference 2021. Now, if you want to catch the whole talk, head along to citybibleforum.org/lifeatwork, where you can purchase an e-ticket to that talk and others from the conference. But in a moment, I'll be joined by Sydney worker Julie Ho, who heard Eddie at the conference, and she and I are going to chat further about what he said and how it impacted her.
The edge. Short, sharp, smart. Everything has an edge. The edge of society and reason, where conformity ends and creativity begins. Several times a year, City Bible Forum invites you and your colleagues to take a look over the edge, to understand where our current thinking is taking us, to see what's happening now, what's coming next, and what you can do about it, live and online. Find out more about The Edge and why it's the perfect event to invite your colleagues along to at thirdspace.org.au/The Edge.
Welcome back. I'm joined now by Julie Ho, who was in the audience at the conference when Eddie spoke. Julie's based in Sydney, where she's worked in various finance roles for Coca-Cola for over 7 years. She's also been involved with City Bible Forum's Head Start program, which is our young workers community ever since it began. So welcome to the podcast, Julie.
All right, thanks so much for having me, Andrew. I think it's just a joy and delight to join in this podcast.
It's great. Look, we'll come to that clip that we just heard from Eddie in a moment, but let's go back to the Under Pressure conference, which you attended. What were some of the standout things that you remember from that day that you took away?
Yeah, so I think thinking back to the idea of being under pressure and that being a blessing, of facing that squeeze in the workplace, that in itself, that tagline was really stuck out to me. Just seeing, pressure's not being a curse in the workplace, but actually something that can be a blessing to us. I think what I was really challenged by was just considering the pressure that we encounter at work as a way for our true character to be revealed, and that God can use pressure to refine and test our faith. And that's an opportunity for us to actually be a faithful witness for God in the workplace. And one of the stories that I really resonated with me from that conference was when we looked at the life of Daniel in the Old Testament. So we saw Daniel as an example of a godly person who remained faithful to God, even though he encountered the threat of persecution and possibly death for disobeying his order. So he had a pretty autocratic employer. I think King Nebuchadnezzar, so it's quite exceptional. But I think the standout for me for Daniel was that he didn't compromise on his Christian faith. And he didn't cave into the king's demands. And so for there are some really clear parallels for us as workers. So whilst we may not be working for a royal king who's quite domineering and autocratic, in our experiences, we do encounter unfair and unjust and harsh employers. But I think underpinning all of this was just the sense that, when we face this, and when we encounter and endure this pressure at work, it doesn't, the strength doesn't come from ourselves, but that strength we can actually ultimately source from Christ through the example that he gave to us on the cross.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And look, just a timeless truth that we need to keep on reminding ourselves of and clinging to, isn't it? Look, let's just reflect a little bit on what Eddie shared that we've just heard. There were some challenging words that he referred to from the book of 1 Peter. To this you have been called, in terms of facing opposition because of your faith. How do you respond when you hear a challenge like that?
It is pretty daunting, I think, that challenge from Eddie. So that talk really resonated with me because he basically called us to follow in the footsteps of Christ. And we know that like Christ suffered for our sake and gave us that ultimate example or model of how to respond to opposition to faith. So for me, it is quite daunting. It's quite challenging, that kind of prospect. And the fact that I think one other point that Eddie made was that we can expect to suffer for our faith and to actually be prepared and be ready for it and not be surprised. So for me, like when I hear that, it's not easy to respond to. I think in the context of our workplace where not only do we just face all sorts of pressure, like just the pressure of like deadlines and immense workloads, but on top of that, the idea that we can be facing pressure for our faith. Instinctively, like I actually kind of would rather avoid or escape these situations where we might avoid encountering that opposition to faith. But I think from Eddie's talk, I was really encouraged to lean into God as a source of strength to sustain us as we endure those pressures of work. But even more so enduring that, it's also how can we seek wisdom from God to navigate those situations where I might encounter opposition, and that ultimately we can actually use this as an avenue for us to be a faithful witness for Christ, or as an ambassador for Christ as well. So for me, it's like the challenge is to not just instinctively want to run away and escape it, but rather actually seeing this pressure as something that can be for our good, but also could be for the benefit of others around us too.
Yeah, look, I don't think you're alone in wanting to run away from that kind of particular pressure. Just fleshing it out a little bit more, have you ever faced pressure particularly because of your faith in the workplace? And if so, how did you handle it?
So for me, I guess thankfully I never had to face the sort of pressure that Daniel faced in the Old Testament, thankfully. But I guess the main pressures that like I would face because of my faith in the workplace is that pressure to conform to that prevailing culture and the values of the workplace, especially when they're at odds with my Christian faith. So I think it is a tricky one with being, I guess, considering the amount of time we spend in the workplace. I think the culture and the values is basically in the air that we breathe, and you're surrounded by your colleagues all the time. And so I think for me, I do sense that pressure to conform to the values of the workplace. So sometimes there are big moments, but often it's more in the subtle sort of everyday kind of conversation. So it might look like pressure to conform to the values that my colleagues might idolize or chase after. So whether it's careerism or pursuing or building up a career or chasing that next promotion, like my peers are, or whether it's like finding that ultimate value or meaning or fulfillment or purpose in work, and I think having your self-worth tied to things like your reviews and your performance reviews, for example. And I think it's an interesting one as well. I think me working in finance, I think often there's that temptation to chase that idol of financial security and money. And in my work, often there are times when we are encouraged to provide input to decisions that might grow the bottom line, but that often comes at the expense of things that will they don't actually help people to flourish, or just maybe whether it's compromising your integrity to to show a better profit result, or other things like gossiping or bad-mouthing a colleague, or blaming them for mistakes that have been made as well. So it is really hard, I think, seeing that pressure day to day. And I think how I try to, respond to these things, a number of ways. I think one is, staying rooted in the word, and I think letting the word renew my mind and my kind of thinking, and helping and letting that be shaped and transformed by the word rather than that prevailing kind of culture that we see. I think also being real about those temptations and the pull of that pressure to conform, but also using those avenues as potential ways that we can have worldview conversations with our colleagues. So understanding what your colleagues or co-workers find important to them, and what they find their meaning, purpose, and work in, and how the gospel and God's worldview offers a different and a better storyline. And I think just asking for wisdom from God as well. Like, I think there are situations where it's quite delicate. So I think knowing whether or not to speak up in a certain situation, or wisdom to actually stay silent in a situation. For example, where it might be more helpful to stay silent is maybe not contributing to gossip about colleagues as well. So I can't say I do this perfectly all the time, but I think there's sort of general principles I try to follow by when it comes to, pressure to conform to some of the prevailing workplace values that you see, especially if it's sort of opposing or a bit counter to what I believe in as a Christian.
I think that's probably true for a lot of Christians in the workplace, that very few perhaps have the big sort of Daniel or Esther moments, if you want to call them that, although they perhaps will come from time to time, but really it's that kind of that daily kind of chipping away at you in terms of feeling you have to soften here or conform there to fit in. That's where the real pressure comes for so many of us most of the time. And you've mentioned there some of the things that really help you in terms of managing that kind of pressure. Prayer and the Word, of course. But is there anything else or anyone else that you found really helps you when you feel that kind of pressure because of your faith in the workplace?
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier that I've been quite heavily involved with the Head Start community. So Head Start is basically the City Bible Forum's Christian young workers community, and I've been involved in that community for the last sort of 7 years. And the thing I love about that community is that we actually try and grapple with the pressures we face as Christians in the workplace. So some of the topics I will look at might be wisdom in navigating workplace politics, or the topic of ambition and what it looks like as a Christian, how to respond well to things like busyness or things like boredom at work, or the temptation to make money or financial security an idol. So I think I draw great encouragement from that community of young workers that I'm part of. And I think just a couple of truths from the Word that I also find great encouragement from. So I think Eddie kind of shared a story from Jeremiah 29, where he shared about the idea that we are placed in our context or workplace context by God's kind of divine appointment, and that knowing that God in His wisdom has actually placed us in these situations, it encourages us to use those well, and the way in which we respond wisely and well can be a great opportunity to be a witness for Christ, and also give a reason for the hope that we have in Christ. And I think another piece I think Eddie did mention in his talk was just that encouragement from knowing that God uses pressure to refine our faith and to grow our godly character. So one of the verses I kind of like to keep coming back to is in James 1, where we're kind of encouraged to consider pure joy when we face trials of all kinds, when the testing of our faith produces perseverance, and so that we might be made mature and complete, which is really, I guess, counterculture and quite difficult to consider it joy, to count those trials as something that we can rejoice in. But I think that verse kind of provides great confidence, strength, knowing that God kind of works in and through those situations. So He tests our faith to produce our perseverance and maturity, and that God uses these pressures to refine and test our faith, so that we can be made mature and complete and grow in godliness and grow in ungodly characters also. There are a couple of verses I like to keep coming back to just to provide that encouragement through those difficult workplace pressures that we face.
Oh, look, they're so basic in one level, isn't it? Prayer, being in the Bible, in God's Word, the importance of Christian community, and yet, as you say there, they're the things that have sustained you and continue to sustain you when you face those challenges because of your faith and feel that pressure to conform. And I love that you finished with reminding us of that truth as well, that God uses these challenges for our good to make us more like Christ. So, Julie, thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing your experience in the workplace in this area.
No, happy to. I'm really glad. I hope that word was a bit of encouragement to anyone who's listening to this podcast as well.
No, wonderful. Thank you. Well, look, that brings us to the end of episode 1 of this brand new podcast. And as Julie said just there, we do really hope that it encourages you whatever your work life looks like. So thank you so much for joining us. Our next episode of this podcast will land in your feeds in a fortnight, where we'll consider the important topic, one that Julie mentioned there as well also, of busyness and rest. So many of us feel overworked and constantly busy, but especially so in the wake of COVID if we're working from home. So how does the gospel help us find rest? I'll be joined by a special guest next time to discuss all of that and more. But until next time, I'm Andrew Laird, and you've been listening to the Life at Work Conference podcast.
The Life at Work Conference podcast is produced by City Bible Forum. To find out more and register for the conference, go to citybibleforum.org/lifeatworkconference.